The year 1954 marked the beginning of the American Civil Rights era. The landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education, overturned the de jure segregation that was rampant throughout the South. For the first time since Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court found, in the words of Chief Justice Earl Warren, that separate but equal has no place in the field of public education. Almost 3 years later, 9 high school students tried to attend a white high school. When they arrived, they were met by a mob of segregationists trying to keep them from physically entering the school.
The local newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette at that time, indicated that the Brown decision was going to change the face of the South forever. I remember those words, and I thought to myself, good, because I think the face of the South ought to change.
Among them was the Arkansas National Guard, which was ordered by Governor Orville Faubus to support the segregationists.
The governor of the state, Orville Faubus, decided that he was going to use Central as his point of resistance. None of us of the 9 anticipated that the resistance would be as strong as it was. The night before we were to go to school, the governor called out the Arkansas National Guard, unbeknownst to us. And when we appeared at Central the first day, the National Guard was there to bar our entrance and let white students go into the school.
President Dwight D. Eisenhower later federalized the Arkansas National Guard, forcing the troops out of the governor's control. The brave students who sued their way into Little Rock High were later known as the Little Rock Nine. Their integration into the all-white school made a statement to the rest of the schools in the South: integrate or pay the consequences. What Eisenhower did in Little Rock gave the court ruling teeth that made it possible for change.
Maybe the world thought that after Little Rock, everything is going to be fixed. And one of the important pieces, I'm sure I don't need it to remind anyone, that the history of slavery in this country makes it very difficult to overcome a lot of issues on race. We're a long way from being perfect.
Similar historic moments spread to higher education. Alabama Governor George Wallace's famous stand at the schoolhouse door was a poignant moment in American history. Governor Wallace promised segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. The University of Alabama was forced to desegregate because Brown v. Board applied to all public schools, which included federally funded universities. Despite the ruling, when hundreds of black students applied to various universities in the South, only one was accepted. When Vivian Malone and James Hood applied to the University of Alabama, a federal judge mandated their admittance. But when they attempted to register for class, Governor Wallace made a symbolic stand at the U of A Foster Auditorium to prevent the black students from entering. Eventually, President John F. Kennedy ordered Wallace to step down and follow the orders of the court.
Governor, I'm not interested in a show. I don't know what the purpose of the show is. I am interested in the orders of these courts being enforced.
When many consider this to be the end of the story, Paul Makrzycki points out that Vivian Malone and James Hood only succeeded in desegregating the school, not integrating the school. Integration required the incorporation into every facet of academic life, and, while the University of Alabama desegregated in a remarkably orderly fashion, Makrzycki argues this was due to the slow pace of desegregation, that students didn't often vocalize their opposition to the gradual changes. Today, the number of non-white students in K-12 education is less than 50%, meaning white students in America's schools no longer have the majority. However, according to this CBS Morning Report,
today, in a classroom of 30, you'll typically find 22 white students and only 8 minority students.
In a world after the Civil Rights era, and in America after Brown v. Board, what's causing these discrepancies? One hint can be found in the comments section of that CBS video, which is predominantly against school integration. One commenter wrote, "When the IQ of an African American child is 85%, the white child's education suffers dramatically." A quick Google search could debunk this statement. Another wrote, "This is not segregation. These people living in predominantly minority neighborhoods are going to the nearest school." This comment fails to acknowledge the historically racist housing policies, income inequalities, and generational education that made it impossible for racial mixing of housing, therefore the full integration of public schools. Because of these racist policies, because of cyclical poverty, and because of apathetic attitudes in the wake of the Civil Rights era, racial uplift continues to be an uphill battle, a battle that starts in the classroom. But just to get in the classroom, Black Americans must defy the odds and fight a system of oppression Beth E. Richard calls the prison nation. Whether you chalk comments like these up to internet trolling, or people actually trying to have a conversation on race, comment sections like these negatively contribute to the discussion about racial equity, and they show the ignorance and apathy that plagues much of America. A good example of this can be found close to home in the Ohio University archives. Though Ohio University desegregated well before Brown v. Board, this letter written in 1944 to former President Gammertsfelter gives a glimpse into the racist policies that existed here on campus. Essentially, 3 black women were eating at a dining hall over the course of a summer session. When Treasurer George Parks caught wind of this, he addressed the president of the university to show his disapproval that black women were eating with white students. To figure this out, you have to dig further back in the archives to a memorandum issued in 1923. This document described how Ohio University was unwilling to enroll black students from southern states, fearing that in doing so would result in a large influx of black students. An article in a 1966 issue of the Post describes tense racial relations on campus, white students ganging up on black students, and black students having trouble commingling with the white students who were willing to be their friends. Today, racial tensions are still felt. In her 2007 article, Women of Color in Higher Education, Stephanie Y. Evans points out that tenured full professors are predominantly white men. What this shows is a broken system that even after the Civil Rights Movement, and even after 3 waves of feminist movements, there is still a system-wide process of oppression, and the people who are getting the worst of it are dealing with the double oppression of being black and being a woman. According to Ritchie, much of the policy drafted between 1996 and 2006 has done very little to combat this intersectional issue, and has contributed to a set of dynamics that made it nearly impossible for the improvement of single black mothers to escape the cycle of poverty. You may remember from a psychology course that Maslow created this hierarchy of needs. If someone wanted to be a self-actualized person, they would first have to meet all their needs first. Essentially speaking, no one wants to pursue arts and crafts if they are being chased by a tiger. The prison nation contributes to intersectional issues against black women because of violence from men against women. Cyclical and intergenerational poverty makes it difficult to find consistent housing, even food. And emotional manipulation by the state, community, and intimate partners create emotional barriers when leaving an abusive situation. With all this working against you, there is no way you could be thinking about college, which would thereby break the cycle of poverty through education, because your biggest priority would be where you're going to find your next meal or how you're going to protect yourself against your abusive partner. Where a black woman's experience differs from a white woman's experience is that a black woman can't rely on her state institutions in the same way a white woman can.
Me and 3 friends are actually sitting on these benches right here. As we're sitting here, a police paddy wagon pulled up. They were looking for a rapist that was on the move in Hamilton Heights. All right, we're females though. You're looking for a male rapist. One of my friends became really hostile. They began to search her, but it wasn't like a regular search that we would be okay with from a man. But then more or less with the patting of the back pockets and then the front pockets, I felt it was really like, okay, now I'm overstepping my boundaries.
This video illustrates the intersectional issues preventing black women today from being able to rely on state institutions such as the police. These same intersectional issues prevent black women from pursuing education to the same degree that their white counterparts do. As discussed, this contributes to the cycle of poverty, which makes it difficult for an individual to achieve greater economic independence. This in turn perpetuates stereotypes, which makes it even more difficult for black women to rely on the state institutions that they require. With over 60 years from the Brown versus Board of Education decision being made, we still live in a largely segregated school system, and therefore a largely segregated society. In the 1943 Negro Yearbook, the author described the need for northern state institutions to better integrate colleges, because the black southern colleges were not getting the funding they needed for the amount of students they had. Meanwhile, northern colleges, like we saw with Ohio University's past, weren't accepting Southern students. This stalemate of colleges only made a bad situation worse for degree-seeking African Americans. An Atlantic article points out that schools today are just as segregated as they were in the 1950s before Brown v. Board of Education, but if not by law, by the effects of cyclical poverty, redlining, and other systemic racist phenomena, that it was so powerful that it was on par with Jim Crow laws. So in conclusion, Brown v. Board of Education failed at integrating public schools because of other societal problems that needed fixing, but were never addressed. I'm going to return to Alabama Governor George Wallace's campaign slogan, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." You know, in a way, he was right about the segregation tomorrow part. We're still living in segregated schools, but the last part of his program, segregation forever, doesn't have to come true.